The federal agents who stormed the luxury penthouse at the Waldorf Astoria in 1951 weren't looking for guns or drugs. They were looking for paper. They were looking for the invisible threads that tied the most powerful man in America to the massive wealth he clearly commanded. As they tore through the silk-lined closets and flipped over hand-carved Italian furniture, they expected to find titles to properties, registration for luxury vehicles, and bank statements with balances that could fund a small nation. But after 12 hours of exhaustive searching, the lead investigator sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than his annual salary and realized a terrifying truth, according to the law. Frank Costello didn't exist. He had no house. He had no car. He had no stock portfolio. The man who sat across from them, calmly sipping an espresso in a $2,000 custom suit, was, on paper, a ghost. Frank Costello understood a fundamental law of power that his rivals ignored: ownership is a liability. In the world of the mafia, men like Al Capone and Dutch Schultz were obsessed with the symbols of their status. They wanted the biggest mansions in Florida and the flashiest armored Cadillacs, but those very symbols were the beacons that led the IRS straight to their front doors. Costello, the Prime Minister, looked at the world through a different lens. He saw every title deed as a potential handcuff and every registered asset as a map for his enemies. For 50 years, he ruled the 5 families of New York while maintaining the lifestyle of a king and the legal footprint of a beggar. He mastered the art of operational invisibility, proving that true power doesn't need to be owned, it only needs to be controlled. The secret wasn't just in hiding money, it was in the psychological architecture of his life. Costello lived at the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most prestigious hotels in the world, yet he never signed a lease. He was driven across the city in a fleet of black sedans, yet he never held a title or a registration in his name. His clothes were the finest silk and wool from Europe, yet they were always paid for in cash by associates who were never seen again. He was the architect of a system where he enjoyed 100% of the luxury with 0% of the risk. To the government, he was a ghost; to the underworld, he was a god. But how does a man maintain that level of discipline for half a century without making a single mistake? How do you own a city without owning a single brick? Before we reveal the specific, genius-level ghost protocol Costello used to keep his fortune invisible, and the one mistake that almost brought his entire shadow empire crashing down, you need to understand the mindset required for this level of dominance. Most people want to be seen; Frank Costello wanted to be felt. If you are the kind of person who understands that the ultimate flex is having everything while appearing to have nothing, then you are exactly where you belong. This channel is for the strategists, the long-term thinkers, and those who know that real influence is found in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button right now and join our elite circle. Give this video a like to signal that you understand the power of anonymity. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type "ghost" in all caps. Let's see who among you has the discipline to stay invisible. Now, let's go back to that penthouse, where the investigators were about to learn that you can't arrest a man who doesn't exist. The agents were baffled. They knew for a fact that Costello had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on renovations for his various residencies. They knew he frequently traveled to hot springs and luxury resorts. Yet, every lead ended in a dead end. The apartments were owned by anonymous holding companies. The cars were registered to security firms that existed only on a post office box in New Jersey. The bills were paid by a rotating cast of nephews and cousins who claimed they were simply being generous to an aging relative. Costello had created a human firewall between himself and his lifestyle. He was the first to realize that in the age of government surveillance, nominee ownership was the only way to survive. This wasn't just about taxes, it was about the psychology of that hit. In the mafia, if a rival wants to hurt you, they strike at your assets. They burn your warehouse, they steal your trucks, or they seize your home. But Costello had nothing to seize. If a rival family decided to target his property, they would find themselves attacking a shell company owned by a legitimate businessman who had no idea who Frank Costello was. He had turned himself into a hard target by making sure there was nothing physical for his enemies to grab onto. He lived in a world where everything was borrowed, yet everything was his. Costello's daily routine was a masterclass in this philosophy. He would wake up in his suite, have his breakfast delivered, and pay for it with a crisp bill that never left a paper trail. He would then walk to his favorite barber shop, a place where he was treated like royalty, but where he never had a standing appointment in his own name. He moved through New York like a shadow through a forest. He was visible to everyone, yet legally traceable to no one. Even the very suits on his back were a part of the strategy. He would buy 10 identical suits at a time, paying for them in cash, so that no matter where he went, he looked exactly the same, a man of consistency, a man who offered the law no unique markers to follow. The IRS agents, led by the relentless Elmer Eyre, were obsessed with the lifestyle gap. This was the mathematical difference between what a person earned on paper and what they spent in reality. For Al Capone, the gap was a canyon. Capone earned nothing but spent like a Roman emperor, and that's what eventually sent him to Alcatraz. Costello, however, managed the lifestyle gap with the precision of a diamond cutter. He made sure that his public lifestyle, the things the government could actually prove, was just modest enough to be explained away. He would tell the tax man that he was a consultant for a local real estate firm, earning a modest salary that just barely covered his hotel bills. The millions that fueled the gambling rackets, the political bribes, and the global shipping interests remained in the invisible zone, but the genius of Costello's no-ownership policy went even deeper than avoiding the IRS. It was his ultimate insurance policy against the shifting tides of the mafia itself. In the underworld, power is often temporary. Bosses are betrayed, families are overthrown, and empires are carved up. Usually, when a boss is ousted, his assets are stripped. But how do you strip a man of assets he doesn't officially own? If Vito Genovese wanted to take over Costello's empire, he would have to find the keys to the kingdom. But the keys weren't in a safe or a bank vault, they were in the heads of 100 different lawyers, accountants, and frontmen scattered across the country. Costello had decentralized his power to the point of being indestructible. He would often tell his younger associates, who were eager to buy gold watches and flashy mansions, a man who owns things is a man who can be robbed. A man who controls things is a man who can never be touched. This was the Costello Doctrine. It was a cold, calculated rejection of the human ego. He was willing to let others take the credit, let others have the titles, and let others have the glory, as long as he had the final say. He was the silent shareholder of New York City, a man who understood that in the high-stakes game of survival, the greatest luxury isn't a mansion, it's the ability to disappear in plain sight. The federal investigators were getting desperate. They began to tail his nephews, the men who paid the bills. They began to tap the phones of the shell companies. But every time they thought they had found a link, it disappeared. One agent, a man who had spent 5 years trying to find a single asset in Costello's name, reportedly said, "It's like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. You can see it, you can smell it, but the moment you close your fingers, there's nothing there." This was exactly what Costello wanted. He was engaging in a 50-year game of psychological exhaustion with the United States government. However, even the most perfect ghost leaves a footprint. In 1952, a small, seemingly insignificant event occurred. A delivery driver made a mistake. A piece of paper that should have been shredded ended up in the wrong hands. It was a receipt for a luxury television set, the latest model, a rarity at the time, delivered to an apartment that didn't exist on any map. This single, tiny crack in the armor was the first clue the government needed to start unraveling the most sophisticated nominee system in history. They realized that Costello's weakness wasn't his greed, but his comfort. And they began to wonder, if the Prime Minister was living as a ghost, who was the man paying for the haunted house? As the government began to focus their entire resources on this one tiny lead, Costello felt the pressure for the first time in his career. He knew that invisible move only works as long as the audience is looking at the wrong hand. But now, the investigators were looking directly at the shadow. He had to make a choice: either abandon the life he had built and vanish truly into the night, or stay and prove once and for all that his ghost protocol was unbreakable. The stakes were no longer just about money or power, they were about the very philosophy of his life. The tiny slip of paper found in a trash heap behind an appliance store on 3rd Avenue was the first physical evidence the government had in 3 decades. It was a receipt for a high-end RCA television set, delivered to a suite at the Majestic Apartments. The name on the receipt was Francesco Castiglia, Costello's birth name, but the signature was a frantic scrawl that didn't match any known record. To Agent Henderson and his team at the IRS, this wasn't just a television, it was a crack in the ghost's armor. They knew that in Costello's world, luxury was a constant, but traceability was a sin. If they could prove that Costello had personally ordered, paid for, and utilized this asset, they could finally establish the link of control that would turn his invisible millions into a taxable reality. The investigation that followed was a grueling game of financial cat and mouse. Henderson began to track the ghost's footprint through the one thing that never lies, the supply chain of luxury. They visited the tailors on Savile Row, the silversmiths in Italy, and the high-end grocers in Manhattan who delivered beluga caviar to the anonymous accounts. What they discovered was a masterpiece of decentralized accounting. Costello didn't have a single bank account, he had 1,000 human ATMs. Every time he needed a payment made, a phone call was placed. A florist in Brooklyn would pay a debt to a dry cleaner in Queens, who would then pay the rent for a penthouse occupied by a friend of the family. It was a circular economy designed to exhaust any investigator who tried to follow the line. Henderson's breakthrough came when he realized that Costello's no-ownership policy relied on a single, psychological vulnerability, the loyalty of the front men. He began a campaign of financial squeezing on every dry cleaner, florist, and lawyer associated with Costello's lifestyle. He wasn't looking for the big bosses, he was looking for the men who signed the checks. "Tell us who gave you the cash for the television," Henderson would bark in the interrogation rooms, "or you're going to spend 5 years in a federal cell for a man who won't even admit he knows your name." It was a brutal strategy, designed to prove that while Costello owned nothing, he was responsible for everything. By the time the case reached the grand jury in 1952, the government had built a lifestyle mountain. They couldn't show a bank statement, but they could show a mountain of luxury goods that had been consumed by a man who officially earned less than a postman. In the courtroom, the tension was electric. Costello sat at the defense table, his hands folded, looking like a dignified grandfather. He didn't look like a man who was hiding a fortune, he looked like a man who was truly, legally poor. His defense was simple and devastatingly effective. In America, is it a crime to have generous friends? Is it a crime to be a guest in a home you do not own? Costello's legal team argued that the nominee system wasn't a criminal conspiracy, but a cultural tradition. They painted a picture of an old-world gentleman who lived on the hospitality of a community that respected him. When the prosecution pointed to the $5,000 suits and the $100 tips, Costello simply whispered into the microphone, "People give to those they respect. I am a man of high respect and low needs." He was using his own reputation as a shield. He was forcing the government to prove a negative, to prove that he wasn't a guest, but the owner of the world around him. The battle shifted to the concept of constructive ownership. The government tried to argue that if a man has the only key to the door, uses the furniture every day, and decides who can enter and leave, he is the owner regardless of what the title says. But Costello had already anticipated this. He made sure that he never held the keys. There was always a concierge, a nephew, or a secretary who officially managed the properties. He never drove the cars, he was a passenger. He never signed the checks, he was the beneficiary. He had successfully separated the utility of wealth from the liability of wealth. As the trial dragged on, the public began to see the IRS as the villain. To the average New Yorker struggling during the post-war era, Costello's ability to live like a king while giving the middle finger to the tax man was almost heroic. He became the invisible man who outsmarted the giant. The government eventually managed to secure a conviction for tax evasion, but the victory was hollow. They sentenced him to 5 years, but they never found the money. Even from behind bars, Costello's ghost protocol remained intact. The millions remained in the hands of his trusted nominees, earning interest, funding rackets, and paying off the very people who were supposed to be guarding him. The true genius of his no-ownership strategy was revealed during his time in prison. When other bosses went to jail, their families often fell apart because the government seized the mansions and froze the accounts. But Costello's family remained in luxury. The apartment stayed open, the cars stayed running, and the silk suit stayed pressed. Why? Because the government couldn't seize what didn't belong to the prisoner. Costello had ensured that his empire was decapitation-proof. You could remove the head, but the body, the vast, anonymous network of assets, would keep moving as if nothing had happened. When Costello was finally released, he returned to the same lifestyle he had left. He walked back into the Waldorf Astoria as if he had just been away for a long weekend. He proved that once you master the art of owning nothing, you can never truly be poor. He spent his final years as a living legend, sitting in Central Park, feeding the pigeons, and meeting with the next generation of power players. He never bought a house. He never registered a car. And when he died in 1973, his official's estate was a fraction of his true worth. The billions he had controlled throughout his life had already been distributed, laundered, and moved into 1,000 different shadows. the legacy of Frank Costello's Ghost Protocol is a masterclass in the difference between status and power. Status is loud, it is visible, and it is fragile. Power is quiet, it is invisible, and it is resilient. Costello knew that the moment you put your name on a piece of paper, you give your enemies a target. By remaining a ghost, he remained untouchable. He taught the world that the ultimate form of security isn't a locked vault. It's the fact that no one knows the vault even exists. He died as he lived, a man who appeared to have nothing, yet influenced everything. His funeral was a quiet affair, attended by the elite of the city he had built and owned in the shadows. There were no massive monuments to his name, no Costello Towers on the skyline. But as the sun set over Manhattan, those in the know understood that every brick in the city was, in some small way, a part of the Prime Minister's invisible estate. He had won the long game by realizing that the greatest luxury in the world is the freedom to be a ghost in a world obsessed with being seen. If this story of strategic invisibility and the ultimate ghost move has changed how you look at power, then you are starting to see the world like the Prime Minister. You understand that true success doesn't need a billboard, it needs a strategy that outlasts the spotlight. Hit that subscribe button if you are ready to master the hidden laws of influence and build your own invisible empire. Give this video a like if you believe that the smartest man in the room is the one the government can't find on paper. And I want you to head down to the comments right now and tell me, if you had $100 million today, would you want the world to know your name, or would you choose the path of the ghost? Let's see who among you has the discipline of Costello. Stay sharp, stay anonymous, and never forget, the man who owns nothing is the only man who can never lose. We'll see you in the next story.